There's a place we all visit sometimes, a place where everything falls apart simultaneously, where the pain feels so overwhelming that closing your heart seems like the only way to survive. Maybe it's watching someone you love slip away from a terminal illness. Maybe it's the shattering of a relationship that defined your identity. Maybe it's the collective weight of a world that seems to have lost its way, where cruelty appears to triumph over compassion daily. In these moments, every spiritual teaching you've ever heard feels like empty words, every meditation practice feels useless, and the idea of maintaining love in the face of such darkness feels not just impossible, but almost insulting to the magnitude of the pain. Yet there's an ancient wisdom that whispers a different truth, that these moments of absolute breakdown aren't obstacles to awakening. They're the very crucible where the deepest love is forged. I spent years as a Harvard psychology professor believing I understood the human mind, thinking I had mapped the territories of consciousness with my research and theories. I wore my intellect like armor, my degrees like shields against the messiness of real human experience. Then one day, everything I thought I knew about myself and reality dissolved completely. Not gradually, not gently, but with the sudden, terrifying completeness of a house of cards collapsing in a hurricane. The person you think you are is remarkably fragile. We spend decades building this elaborate construction of identity, your name, your profession, your beliefs, your relationships, your dreams, your fears, and we mistake this construction for who we actually are. It's like living in a beautiful dollhouse and forgetting there's a whole world outside. Until the moment comes when the dollhouse walls simply fall away. This can happen in countless ways. Sometimes it's a diagnosis that changes everything. Sometimes it's the death of someone who was so central to your world that their absence leaves you questioning the reality of everything else. Sometimes it's the slow realization that the life you've been living belongs to someone else entirely, that you've been sleepwalking through your own existence, following scripts written by parents, society, or some version of yourself that no longer fits. When my carefully constructed academic identity began to dissolve, I felt like I was dying. In a way, I was. The ego death that comes with profound spiritual awakening isn't metaphorical. It feels like literal annihilation. Everything you've used to orient yourself in the world, every reference point for understanding who you are, simply vanishes. You're left floating in a void, not knowing if you'll ever find solid ground again. But here's what I discovered in that terrifying dissolution. What you think you are is not who you are. The person you've been performing, even to yourself, is like a costume you've been wearing for so long you forgot you could take it off. Beneath that costume is something much more real, much more vast, and much more resilient than you ever imagined. The sacred breakdown is not a malfunction of the spiritual path, it's the path itself. Every mystical tradition speaks of this necessary dismantling. The Christians call it the dark night of the soul. The Sufis speak of fana, the annihilation of the false self. The Buddhists understand it as the dissolution of the illusion of a separate self. Whatever name you give it, it's the same process, the stripping away of everything that isn't essential, everything that isn't true, everything that isn't love. This dismantling rarely happens according to our preferences or timelines. It doesn't politely ask permission or wait for a convenient moment. It arrives like a tsunami, washing away the sandcastles of our carefully arranged lives. And in those moments when everything familiar has been swept away, we're left with a choice that will determine the entire trajectory of our spiritual journey. We can spend our energy frantically trying to rebuild the same structures, to become again who we were before the breakdown. This is the path of spiritual bypassing, of using meditation and prayer and positive thinking to reconstruct the ego in slightly more attractive packaging. It's the path of trying to return to the dollhouse even though we've seen the sky. Or we can stay in the terrible, beautiful space of not knowing. We can resist the urge to immediately construct a new identity, a new set of beliefs, a new way of making sense of existence. We can learn to be comfortable with the discomfort of not having solid answers, of not knowing who we are or what we're supposed to do next. This is where the real spiritual work begins, not in the mountaintop experiences or the moments of blissful clarity, but in the willingness to remain present with the complete collapse of everything you thought you could count on. It's here, in this space of sacred unknowing, that you begin to discover what in you is indestructible. The awareness that's witnessing your thoughts doesn't that. Anka, the consciousness that's observing your emotions doesn't feel. The essence that's watching your identity dissolve doesn't depend on any particular form to exist. This witnessing presence has been with you since the moment you took your first breath, and it will be with you when you take your last. It's what the mystics call the soul, what the Buddhists call Buddha nature, what the Hindus call the Atman. When you meet this presence, really meet it, not just as a concept, but as a lived reality, everything changes. Not because you've gained something new, but because you've remembered something that was always there. You realize that the person you thought you were was never more than a wave on the ocean, temporary and ever-changing. But you, the real you, are the ocean itself. This recognition doesn't come through thinking or analyzing or trying to figure it out. It comes through a kind of relaxing, a settling back into what you've always been. It's like taking off shoes that were too tight and feeling the relief of being barefoot. The soul doesn't need to be created or achieved or earned. It simply needs to be uncovered, like a precious stone that's been buried under layers of sediment. Once you've touched this deeper reality, once you've experienced yourself as consciousness rather than content, the whole game changes. The fears that once paralyzed you reveal themselves as stories. The anger that once consumed you shows itself as a passing weather pattern. The sadness that once defined you becomes simply another color in the palette of human experience. This doesn't mean the emotions disappear or that you become some kind of spiritual robot. If anything, you feel more deeply, more authentically, more fully human. But you're no longer imprisoned by your feelings. You're no longer mistaking the waves for the ocean. You know yourself as the space in which all experience arises and passes away. From this place of knowing, love becomes not something you do, but something you are. Compassion isn't a practice you engage in. It's the natural expression of seeing clearly. When you recognize that the consciousness looking out through your eyes is the same consciousness looking out through every other pair of eyes, how can you not love? When you understand that the awareness in you is the awareness in everyone, how can you not serve? This is the gift hidden in the breakdown, the grace concealed in the collapse. When everything you thought you were falls away, what remains is what you've always been. Love itself, wearing the temporary costume of a human being, walking each other home through this brief, precious, heartbreaking dream we call life. But knowing yourself as love and actually keeping your heart open when life is tearing you apart are two very different things. The spiritual insight that you are consciousness itself is beautiful, but it can feel like a cruel joke when you're sitting in a hospital room watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, or when you're holding your child as they struggle with addiction, or when you're facing your own mortality with all its terror and uncertainty. This is where the real spiritual work begins, not in the comfortable moments of clarity, but in the excruciating choice to remain soft when everything in you wants to harden. The heart, you see, has two ways of responding to unbearable pain. It can close, building walls of protection that keep the hurt out but also keep the love out. Or it can break open, becoming larger, more spacious, more capable of holding both the agony and the beauty of being human. Most of us have experienced both responses. When someone hurts us deeply, the immediate instinct is to close down, to protect ourselves from further damage. We build elaborate defense systems, stories about why we can't trust, reasons why it's safer to stay guarded. And these defenses work in a way. They do keep us from feeling the full impact of life's cruelties, but they also keep us from feeling life's gifts. The heart that breaks open takes a different path. Instead of contracting around the pain, it expands to include it. Instead of building walls, it creates space. This isn't about becoming a doormat or failing to protect yourself from genuine harm. It's about recognizing that the very thing that's breaking you can also be the thing that breaks you open to a love you never knew was possible. When my guru, Neem Karoli Baba, spoke about keeping your heart open, he wasn't talking about some sentimental, sweet kind of love. He was talking about a fierce, uncompromising commitment to staying present with life exactly as it is, not as you wish it were. He was talking about the courage to let your heart be broken over and over again, because a broken, open heart is infinitely more useful than a closed one. This kind of openness isn't naive. It sees clearly the suffering in the world, the cruelty and injustice and senseless loss, but it also sees something else, the possibility that this very suffering can become the doorway to unprecedented compassion. When you're willing to feel your own pain completely without numbing or escaping or explaining it away, you develop the capacity to be with other people's pain in the same way. The darkness that overwhelms us often feels like proof that there's no divine presence, no loving consciousness underlying existence. When you're in the depths of despair, when the world seems to have lost all meaning, when every prayer feels like it's bouncing off a ceiling of indifference, the last thing you want to hear is that God is somehow present in this mess. But what if the darkness isn't the absence of the divine? What if it's another face of the same consciousness that shows up as light? What if the moments when you feel most abandoned by God are actually the moments when you're being invited into a deeper, more intimate relationship with the sacred? This isn't about finding silver linings or looking for reasons why bad things happen to good people. It's about recognizing that the same awareness that's present in joy is also present in sorrow, that the same consciousness that witnesses you or bliss is also witnessing your devastation. The divine doesn't leave you when life gets difficult. It shows up in a form you might not recognize. Sometimes God appears as the stranger who offers you a tissue when you're crying in public. Sometimes as the friend who sits with you in silence when there are no words that can help. Sometimes as the part of you that keeps breathing even when you don't want to continue living. The sacred isn't always dressed in white robes with a peaceful smile. Sometimes it's wearing the face of your deepest pain, inviting you to discover what in you is larger than any circumstance. Learning to find the divine in darkness requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience. Instead of dividing life into good and bad, sacred and profane, you begin to see everything as an expression of the same underlying consciousness. The cancer is as holy as the sunset. The betrayal is as sacred as the wedding. The funeral is as divine as the birth. This doesn't mean you pretend to be grateful for suffering or that you don't work to alleviate pain when possible. It means you stop waiting for life to be different before you can recognize its sacred nature. You stop requiring God to show up in forms that make you comfortable. You learn to bow to the mystery even when it's wearing the mask of your worst nightmare. The alchemical transformation that turns personal pain into universal compassion isn't something you do. It's something that happens when you stop interfering with the natural process of the heart. When you're willing to feel your own suffering completely, without trying to fix it or understand it or make it go away, something remarkable occurs. The pain begins to compost itself, becoming fertile ground for a love that extends far beyond your personal boundaries. This transformation isn't immediate or easy. It requires a kind of spiritual courage that goes against every instinct for self-preservation. You have to be willing to stay present with feelings that would normally send you running for the nearest exit. You have to resist the urge to turn your pain into a story about what's wrong with the world, or what's wrong with you, or what's wrong with God. Instead, you learn to hold your suffering like a mother holds a crying child, with tenderness, with patience, with the understanding that the pain is asking for attention, not solutions. You discover that the very thing that's breaking your heart is also breaking it open to a compassion that can hold the heartbreak of the entire world. When you've learned to be with your own pain in this way, you naturally become someone who can be with other people's pain without trying to fix it or change it or make it go away. You become a presence that can hold space for the full range of human experience without judgment or resistance. You become what the world desperately needs, someone who can sit with suffering without being overwhelmed by it, someone who can love without conditions. The most liberating realization in this entire process is that you don't need to understand why things happen the way they do. You don't need to have reasons or explanations or spiritual frameworks that make sense of senseless loss. You don't need to believe that everything happens for a reason or that there's some cosmic plan that justifies every tragedy. What you need is the willingness to release your grip on the story of how things should be. Every time you find yourself thinking, this shouldn't be happening, you're arguing with reality. And as one wise teacher said, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only every time. The story of why this shouldn't be happening is often more painful than the actual experience itself. The mental narrative that protests against what is, that insists life should be fair or predictable or kind, creates a layer of suffering on top of the unavoidable pain of being human. When you can drop that story, when you can stop requiring life to make sense according to your preferences, you free up enormous amounts of energy that can be redirected toward love. This doesn't mean you become passive or that you stop working to make the world better. It means you act from a place of response rather than reaction, from acceptance rather than resistance. You do what you can to alleviate suffering, but you don't torture yourself with the illusion that you can control outcomes. You love as fully as possible, but you don't demand that your love be returned in the form you expect. In a world that often rewards cynicism and celebrates the safety of emotional distance, choosing love in the face of hatred becomes an act of revolutionary courage. When everyone around you is closing their hearts, when the news is filled with stories that make compassion feel foolish, when your own pain is so overwhelming that numbness seems like the only rational response, the decision to keep loving anyway becomes a radical political act. This isn't the Hallmark card version of love, with its gentle sentiments and comfortable boundaries. This is love as a fierce commitment to staying human when inhumanity seems to be winning. It's the love that shows up at the bedside of someone who's dying alone. It's the love that reaches across the artificial divisions of race, religion, and ideology to touch the shared humanity underneath. It's the love that refuses to let bitterness have the final word, even when bitterness would be completely justified. When I was younger, I thought love was something that happened to you when conditions were right, when you found the right person, when you felt safe, when life was going well. But as I've grown older, I've come to understand that real love is something you choose, especially when conditions are all wrong. It's easy to love when love is easy. The spiritual work is learning to love when love feels impossible. This kind of love requires a different kind of strength than the world typically recognizes. It's not the strength of dominance or control, but the strength of vulnerability. It's not the power to force outcomes, but the power to remain open when everything in you wants to close. It's the courage to keep showing up with your heart in your hands, even when that heart has been broken so many times it feels like it's held together with tape and hope. The beautiful thing about this choice is that it's always available to you. No matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how justified your anger or fear or despair, you can always choose love in the next moment. You can choose to see the person who's hurt you as someone who's suffering. You can choose to respond to hatred with curiosity instead of retaliation. You can choose to let your heart break open instead of closed. This doesn't make you weak or naive. It makes you dangerous to the forces that depend on division and fear to maintain their power. A person who refuses to hate, who insists on seeing the humanity in everyone, who chooses love over and over again despite every reason not to, this person is a threat to every system that depends on our separation from one another. One of the most healing discoveries you can make in the depths of your own hell is that you're not alone there. The territory of profound suffering is surprisingly well populated. Once you stop hiding your pain, stop pretending that you have it all figured out, you begin to recognize the walking wounded everywhere. You see the grief in the grocery store clerk's eyes. You notice the loneliness in your neighbor's too bright smile. You recognize the fear in the stranger's defensive posture. This recognition becomes a form of communion. When you're no longer trying to maintain the fiction that you're different from other people, that your pain is unique or your struggles are special, you can meet others in the authentic place where we're all just human beings trying to make sense of an often senseless existence. You realize that the very thing that made you feel most isolated, your suffering, is actually what connects you most deeply to the rest of humanity. There's a particular kind of friendship that forms between people who've been through hell together. It's not based on shared interests or compatible personalities, but on the recognition that you've both been broken open by life and somehow found the courage to keep going. These friendships often require few words because you understand each other at a level that goes beyond language. You've both been to the places where polite conversation doesn't reach. When you're in the midst of your own breakdown, these fellow travelers become lifelines. They're the ones who don't try to fix you or cheer you up or convince you that everything happens for a reason. They're the ones who can sit with you in the darkness without being afraid of it, who can hold space for your pain without trying to take it away. They know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply witness someone suffering without trying to change it. Finding your people in this way is one of the unexpected gifts of going through hell. You discover that there's an underground network of souls who've been tempered by suffering and transformed by it. They're not bitter or broken despite everything they've been through. They're some of the most compassionate, wise, and genuinely helpful people you'll ever meet. They've learned that the only way out of hell is through it, and they're willing to walk with you while you find your own way. These connections remind you that healing isn't something you do alone in isolation. It's something that happens in relationship, in community, in the spaces between people who've learned to love without conditions. When you're supported by others who understand the territory you're navigating, you begin to trust that you too will make it through. You begin to believe that your pain has purpose, that your suffering is composting into something that will serve not just you, but everyone whose life you touch. This is perhaps the most profound realization of all, that there's something in you that cannot be touched by any circumstance, no matter how devastating. No matter what you lose, no matter what breaks, no matter what dies, there's an essence that remains untouched and untouchable. Call it the soul, call it consciousness, call it the divine spark. It doesn't matter what name you give it. What matters is that you come to know it as your deepest reality. This indestructible light isn't something you have, it's something you are. It's not a possession that can be taken from you or a quality that can be damaged. It's the very ground of your being, the source from which all experience arises and to which all experience returns. When you know yourself as this light, you understand that everything else, your body, your emotions, your thoughts, your circumstances, are simply temporary expressions of this eternal essence. This doesn't mean you become detached from life or that you stop caring about what happens to you and the people you love. If anything, you care more deeply because you're no longer protecting yourself from caring. You engage more fully because you're no longer afraid of being hurt. You love more completely because you know that love is what you are, not just what you do. The recognition of this indestructible essence changes everything about how you relate to suffering. You still feel pain, perhaps more acutely than before, but you're no longer consumed by it. You still grieve losses and struggle with challenges, but you're no longer defined by them. You still get angry and sad and afraid, but you're no longer imprisoned by these emotions. From this place of knowing, you can be with your own pain and the pain of others without being overwhelmed by it. You can love without attachment to outcomes. You can serve without needing to be the savior. You can be present with life exactly as it is, not as you wish it were, because you know that your true nature is untouched by any of it. This is the ultimate freedom, not the freedom from suffering, but the freedom to suffer consciously, to let your heart be broken open by the beauty and tragedy of existence, knowing that what you really are can never be broken. This is the peace that passes understanding, not the absence of turmoil, but the presence of something larger than any storm. When you've found this indestructible light within yourself, you naturally become someone who can help others find it too. You become a beacon fool, or those who are lost in their own darkness, a reminder that there's something in them that cannot be destroyed no matter what they've been through. You become what the world desperately needs, someone who can hold space for the full catastrophe of human existence without being crushed by it. The journey from hell to wholeness isn't a linear path with clear signposts and guaranteed outcomes. It's more like learning to dance with the darkness, to find grace in the midst of chaos, to discover that your deepest wounds can become your greatest gifts. It's the recognition that we're all just walking each other home through this brief, precious, heartbreaking dream we call life. And in the end, perhaps that's all we can do. Keep our hearts open, love as fiercely as we can, and trust that the light within us is strong enough to illuminate even the darkest passages. We're all just love and drag, pretending to be separate, forgetting that we're all expressions of the same divine consciousness playing hide and seek with itself. The spiritual journey is simply the process of remembering who we've always been, of coming home to the love that we are. So when life brings you to your knees, when everything you thought you could count on falls away, when your heart is breaking and you don't know how you're going to make it through another day, remember this: you are not your circumstances. You are not your pain. You are not your fear. You are the awareness in which all of these experiences arise and pass away. You are the love that's been seeking itself through every form, every face, every moment of this magnificent, terrible, beautiful human experience. Keep your heart open. Trust the process. We're all just walking each other home.